Welcome to Chop Shop Motors. My name is Clay, and we're going to do a segment and kind of dive in to a project that I've had for a super long time, and I haven't messed with it, and it's time. So for those of you who figure you'll never get around to it, sometimes it just takes a while. So what we're going to do, I've had a small block Ford out of probably I think it's a 65 casting number, C5 289, and I've had this engine for probably 40 years, and that sounds terrible. So I bought it as a core when I was working in a little shop. It got turned in and they didn't know what was wrong with it, and I ended up buying it. So it sat in my other shop forever. It's moved around a few times, and I was up there trying to thin out some stuff and figure out what I'm going to do with some stuff and just try to bring order, right? We always got to bring order to our hobbies and this car thing. And I came across this motor, and I knew I had it, but I had actually looked for it when I built the motor for the 64 two-door hardtop, the little Falcon, and I stepped over it. I didn't think it was the motor. I didn't think it was that motor, and so I didn't grab it. And ultimately, it just had some different valve covers on it, and it was this little Core 289. So I decided at that point, I'm gonna bring this motor down and play with it, see if it'll run, and see what it's gonna take to turn it into a motor. The backstory on the motor was your typical iffy backstory. It was supposedly rebuilt, and they couldn't get it to run right, etc., etc. They replaced it with another motor and turned it in as a core. So that's always kind of like, chances are there's some big problems. But I thought, what the heck? So this is the motor. We're going to pull it apart and do a little autopsy on it. See if it's worth just cleaning up and putting back together. And I might build a run stand just for this motor, just so I can see how it runs before I put it in anything. So that's kind of what the plan is. So let's show you this motor. So here it is. It's got 65 289 heads on it. The oil pan that's on it is a 66 Bronco. That was an oil pan I put on it so I could put it in on the engine part. So that isn't a telltale around where the motor came from. I don't remember what the motor was out of, so my memory is not good enough to pull that up. The front, the cam gear's been rubbed off of it. There's no front cover. It's got freeze plugs that have been replaced, so it's obviously run some. Sorry, I'll get around here. The couple of little things that have been pulled off of it are because it is another motor was put in its place, and I've got all those trinkets. The interesting thing is it's got guide plates on this head, screw-in studs and guide plates. This head is different. It does not have guide plates because it has the early heads that don't need it doesn't need guide plates on this one. So this is, let's see what this is. This is a 65. I'm just looking at the number, doing a little research right here while we're on camera. 65 289. Let's look at this side. This one is 65 289, but the difference is this head, while it's the same ballpark, it used a different valve and rocker than the other head. So, interesting. So it's got guide plates on it. This side, it doesn't need them on this side. Probably ran that way. The heads, as I recall, the heads were off of it when I got it. But I don't know. The other thing, as I'm just looking, it's got a mismatch set. It's got all kinds of craziness going on the screw and stud. So it's got lots of different screw and stud sizes. This side has 2 screw and studs, and the rest are press in. Oh boy. So this is the project where I'm gonna treat it just like it is. It's a core. We'll see if we can pull apart, see what went wrong with it, see if it's worth doing. I mean, it's definitely worth saving, unless it's, unless the block's 60 over, it's worth doing something with. So we'll pull the heads off and start to play with it here. I'll bring you back when we tear it down a little bit. Time to dive into this little 289. We'll pull the rocker arms, get the push rods out. It's got a mixture of different rocker arm nuts. It's got some different studs. This side has all screw-in studs, so that's good. But everything is just a little different. So we'll take note of that. We're doing a little bit of an autopsy as we go along to see what's going on. So this push rod had been out. So these had all been out. This one's been replaced. It's different than the rest. Not different in length, but just different in manufacturer. Get all this stuff out of the way. So it looks like some of the valves have been getting banged on pretty good. So we'll know more when we actually pull the heads apart. Interesting that it has screw-in studs on all of them except on all of them on this side, and then only 2 on this right bank. And some of these are junk as it. So let me show you what I mean. So as we look at these studs, you can see, well, you might not be able to see, but on this one right here, the rocker arm had been at a severe angle and worn a ton on that stud. So that stud's no good on that one. This one's worn a bunch. These 2 have screw-ins, and then these 2 are press-ins, and this one at the very end has a severe divot in the edge. So there's some problems with the studs. if you look at the heads of the valves, you might not be able to tell, I don't know if it'll focus enough, but some of them are focusing. Some of them are look pretty decent, and then other ones look like they've been hammered on. So we're gonna have to deal with that. On this side you can see, which one am I looking at? Where the rocker arm was so crooked. Yeah, so this one, sorry, this one, the rocker arm was rubbing on the side of the stem and put a groove in it, and right here the retainer has a big groove in it. So that's really dangerous, because what will happen is it's possible for the rocker arm to push that down and actually let the retainers fall out, and then it drops the valve. Same here. That stud's junk on this one. So we've got some valve train issues. So we'll want to take a really good look at what's going on here with those heads and decide. It's going to really depend on how the rest of the motor looks, but decide on how we want to do it. I've got another set of heads that I already built that we could use, so we have options. But I have a feeling it's possible that this has got a really rumpy cam in it, and that would say we probably have some pretty stiff springs, and that could be causing some of our problems, and that might be why we've pulled multiple studs out of the heads. So let's get you set up and we'll pull some more apart. This head had been off before, so the head bolts weren't that tight, and I had checked them before to make sure they were loose enough. So got a little impact brake free. Right. Let's see what lurks. Okay. Whoa! There's a spider in there. So we got one spider. No surprise. We have messed up his home. All right. Well, let me show you what we found. So as we look at this, we can see that the cylinders are a little dirty, but nothing too horrible about that. For sitting 40 years probably. The interesting part is it's got a performance piston in it. So we'll find out in a minute when we pull those out. We'll scrape it and see what size it is. But I would say it is probably at least a 9-to-1 piston. So it's got a little bit of a pop-up in it. So let's take a quick check and see what size it is. So I took a scraper to the top of that piston just to see what size it was, and I was hoping for 30, but that little motor's bored 60. So 60 over on a 289, that's a lot. So these little motors do not like to be bored 60. So chances are that the problems this motor had were that of overheating. That is pretty much the problem you run into when you try to go 60, especially with a dome piston. If it's an aggressive piston, that makes it even tougher. But we'll continue to dig and see what else we find as we pull it apart some more. All right, so the other head's off. Nothing looks particularly sketchy inside, so we'll just continue to pull it apart. The head gasket didn't look blown. This side hadn't been off, and it looked like all the cylinders were firing. No damage to any of the pistons. So at least at this point, there isn't a smoking gun, so to speak, yet as to what was going on with this motor. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the lifters out. I'm going to keep them in order because I could put a set of lifters in it, but I'm going to keep them in order for now. And there's a possibility that if it turned out good enough, what I would do is clean everything up, put it back together. Fords are pretty hard on rod bearings, so I'll probably put a set of rod bearings in it, reseal everything, build the heads, do some of that stuff, and give it a shot. Just run a little gamble. But we'll have to see how the bottom end looks. So for right now, I'm going to pull the lifters out and keep them in order, and then we'll flip it over and pull the rods out. Okay, so let's see if we can get these lifters out of here. This motor has been together for a long time. Which might not bode well for getting the lifters out. Okay, so far it's not going too good. Okay, let me play with these. I'll bring it back. Okay, lifters are out. The four at the front, where the front of the motor was open, were a little tough to get out. I had to spray some WD-40 on it, kind of fiddle with them, and finally they slid out. The rest slid out really easy, considering how long the oil has been sitting in there. I'm probably not surprised that there was a little bit of an issue. So now I'm going to pull the retainer plate off the camshaft. As gently as possible, pull the cam out. We're trying to be as careful as possible for a couple reasons. One, you never want to misuse or rough up the camshaft. And two, we want to, if possible, maybe reuse these cam bearings, although, I don't know, that front cam bearing already looks kind of marginal, so I think I've got a set of cam bearings I can put in it. Cam bearings are kind of they're the evil animal when you have low oil pressure. That's where it happens. Alright, so now what we're going to do, we're going to do a little, this is what I don't know if I can see this or not. So, the back of that camshaft, it says Iscadarian, and it says 280 hydraulic. So it's got an Isky cam in it, 280 hydraulic, 381. It's got a part number on it, so I can cross that cam over and see exactly what the lift is on that camshaft, we'll know exactly what we're working with as we put this thing back together. So that's pretty cool. All right, camshaft's out. Looks like kind of a cool piece. It had an automatic behind it, so we'll see what that ISCI number crosses over to and see what kind of problems, if there were any, with lift and stuff on that camshaft and running an automatic. Right, let's spin this bad boy over and get the pan off of it. Oh, interesting. So my engine stem bolt's too long, so it won't let me spin it over. Okay, it's gonna get tricky. Okay. That's always good. The sound of things rattling in the oil pan. Okay, pull this Bronco pan off. This is a really cool pan, but interestingly, I have another one of these in inventory. Oh, there's the pickup. Okay, great. So I have the pickup and the pan. That's awesome. We'll wrap this and get it in inventory. Use it on something cool. I put that, did a Bronco changeover years ago that came off of. And a 351 is a different pan than a 302. So I wasn't able to use the pan and pickup, or I didn't. Definitely couldn't use the pan, probably could have used the pickup. But I needed the dipstick tube for the other application. So that's that. It has a main bolt here that has the tank broken off. So we'll do a little surgery on fixing the oil pump pickup and save it for another project. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm checking to see if things are numbered correctly. So this bank that I'm looking at on my side is 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. Never assume that any of that stuff is correct. So things look decent in here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull it apart. And I have, flip this around to make sure that what I'm looking at is what you're looking at. What I have is kind of a special tool for knocking the pistons out. It's got an angle on the end that allows me to slide down inside and gently tap that piston. Without damaging anything. And I can tell you right now the bearings look a little rough. Just starting to come out. Okay. Okay, so this is the part where you want to be pretty careful if you plan on reusing anything. So this bearing is touching copper, so that would not be a candidate to ever use over. Let's take a look and see what size it is. Well, we're going to look at a couple things. So inside the piston looks good, skirts look good. The rings have the oil grooves lined up, so that's not good. So my thought is we'll do a little checking. We'll check the end gaps, but we may be okay on the piston. Definitely first piston out, we're okay on. Motor has no ridge, so I'm just going to kind of slide this back together to keep everything here. I'm not worried about the bearings, because I already can tell you we're not planning on putting those bearings back in it. From the look of the cam bearings, it's going to be money well spent to just put cam bearings and rod bearings and probably main bearings. The crank looks really good, at least the first one off looks really good. So everybody has their own kind of approach for doing things like this. We could definitely tear it all apart. We could spend the money to have everything done on it. So it's got 10 under rod bearings, so that's nice. That's a good size for the crank. That's fantastic. And we could spend a boatload of money building this. So I'm gonna flip it up and we'll just chat about that for just a minute. You could spend a boatload of money putting the motor back together, but that's not really the plan on this motor. This motor is, my gut feeling was it was a good candidate to just figure out what had happened to it before and put it back together, get it running again, and have it be a good usable motor. It's be a street motor. That's all it's going to be. And I've got a really nice standard bore 289 block that would be perfect to build, and we would spend a fair chunk of change to do it. And I just did one. I know exactly how much it's going to cost. This one, the idea was, if it's usable, then let's use it. It's already 60 over, so I can tell you right now, there's no boring it and building it. So it's got good pistons, it's got a nice bore. We're going to hone it. It's going to be fantastic. The crank, if the rest of the crank looks as good as the first journal off, we're going to be set to use that crankshaft. So that's another $100. Have a crank turned, camshaft and lifters, probably $350 to buy a camshaft and lifters. Those are good. We'll have to pull some parts out of inventory. We're gonna have to get some. So cam bearings I should be able to have. If I don't, we can buy them. Rods and mains I won't have, so we'll have to get some bearings for it. But we're still looking at a pretty inexpensive build if things keep going the direction they're going. So let's keep tearing it apart. This motor is not turned over in a very long time, so no surprises that took a little bit of effort. I'm taking great care to make sure none of the rod bolts hit that crankshaft. You don't want anything to bump it. I'm going to kind of block your view a little bit here. Okay. What I'm checking for is I'm checking right along here, right along the skirts to see if there's any cracks. This is where small blocks tend to crack, and that would deem this piston junk. But this one's super nice, looks awesome. Love it. Okay, we'll spin it over a little bit. Get a couple more. I like to pull the rod of the piston I'm knocking out right over so it's perfectly lined up. So that I can kind of watch what's going on. And I don't have to worry as much about the crank falling into the big end of the rod journal falling into the crank. So this motor's been stiff for a long time, sitting there for years. So the rod doesn't spin super easy on the piston. If this motor had just come out of a car, that rod would flop around like crazy. So you have to pay more attention when the motor's a little bit fresher. There's nothing fresh about this motor. This motor is the opposite of fresh. Okay, rods are all out. We're going to pull the crank out now. So, depending on what kind of motor you're building or rebuilding or pulling apart, some have numbers cast into the main caps and some don't. Fords have numbers, small blocks have numbers cast into the main bolts, so no worries. On a motor that doesn't, you're going to want to make sure and number stamp to make sure the mains go back in exactly the same spot they came out of. No mix and matching. I'd already broken these loose. Okay. Pull one off, let's see what we have here. Okay. My crank looks usable. Bearing's not coppery. Two down. Okay, let's see what we got for the bearing size. 10 thousandths. So we got a 1010 crank. All right, let's get the rest of the caps off. The middle one's always just a little tougher because it's a thrust. on a small block Ford. If it was a small block Chevy, it'd be at the back, but on this, they're right here in the middle. Bearing has a little bit of copper in it, so probably struggling a little bit. Who knows how rough they've been on this motor. Thrust bearing looks good. The crankshaft doesn't have big grooves ground in it, which would have ruined it. So, good deal. Probably not an issue with an automatic. If it would have had a manual in it and the pushing of a heavy-duty clutch on it can sometimes cause problem. Bearings look pretty worn. So when these motors get down to the copper, that's not a good sign. Rear looks good. Rear main seal's incorrect, which isn't always the case. Okay. All right, and we'll pull the crankshaft out. Okay, so here's what we have going on a little 289 that was built to run hard. Okay, as we look, let's kind of start at what you see first. Main bearings, not horrible, but the discoloring usually happens on the cap end of main bearings. So we saw some discolored, some not discolored like heat, but down into the copper. So time for bearings. If you look in the cylinders, I don't know if you can see it, but the cylinders look really nice, which is awesome. I mean, it's what we want. It doesn't look like it's brand new. It doesn't, I mean, it's not like you're, oh my gosh, there's the hone marks, but it definitely looks good, and there's no ridge at all on the motor. So another good sign. As you look down at the cam bearings from this angle, cam bearings look brand new. They look so good from this angle. Problem is cam bearings don't wear on the top. Cam bearings wear on the bottom. So if you look at, let me see if I can flip this over a little bit. So we'll take a look at the bearings at the top and see if they look okay. Now this bearing already looks kind of crappy right there. So I don't trust that one at all. So that's where they're going to be worn because the valve lifters are pushing down on them. So we're going to put some bearings in there. There are the cylinders, looking really good. So now, what are we going to do next? Well, let me put you in the stand and we'll talk about that. All right, so what are we going to do next on this little 289? So sometimes when you do an autopsy on a motor like this, you find that what you were hoping for isn't the reality. So a little while ago, maybe it's probably been a couple years or a year and a half, we pulled apart 292, which I'm going to come back to here actually in the next month or so and finish pulling it apart. But you pull a motor apart and you think it's going to be like really good and a slam dunk, and you almost do a super heavy duty tune up on it and it's good to go. And that motor was wore out. So this one was like, hey, I don't know if it's going to be any good. I have, you know, knowledge from somebody that turned it in as a core forever ago, and maybe it's good, maybe my memory faded, maybe they told me something back then and I missed a detail that would really help me out, who knows. But I've built a fair number of motors and I'm pretty good at doing an autopsy, so I can usually tell what the culprit was on a motor. In fact, I would much rather pull the motor apart myself than have someone bring me a motor all in pieces that they took apart. because I want to see when a rod cap was on backwards, or a main bearing had something goofy happen, or any number of things that can happen to a motor. I want to be the one who finds that, and then I can decide what I want to do. So at this point, the motor's dirty, but it looks salvageable. So my next step is I'm going to take and we'll jet clean the block. We'll get everything knocked out of it. We'll get the water jacket so we can see it. Somebody's put some, it's had freeze plugs sort of knocked into it, and a couple or lots of mismatched things. Well, I don't want to run any risk on somebody else's mismatch. So for the cost of a few of those pieces, it's just not worth the effort to not replace them. So we'll put freeze plugs in it for sure. I'm going to put some cam bearings in it just because it's safe insurance. And then we will order up some rod bearings and some main bearings, and we'll stick the short block back together. Then I've got a timing set in stock for it. I think I've got an oil pump. We'll clean up the valve train, and then I gotta figure out what I want to do on the heads. So the heads are just a touch scary. So they've had a few too many tricks done to them for me to be okay with them. The camshaft's probably got too much lift for a stock set of springs. So I'm going to do a little research on the camshaft, find out what that Isky cam crosses over to lift and duration, and then we'll find out, do we want to change and get into the heads. So that's kind of where we're at. This is a fun little project. The goal is to fire it up and listen to it run and have one ready for something if we buy it. And so no plans slated for this little motor. So we're just having fun with parts we already had. I'm Clay for Chop Shop Motors, and we'll see you on the next project.